FBSC Finance brings you 30 Minutes in Finance, your weekly finance-related podcast. I'm your host, David Garbutt.
Thank you very much for having me on. My name's Edward G. I'm a insolvency practitioner and I also act as a property receiver. I'm based in Manchester. My firm is called CG & Co. We've been trading for 10 years this year. We act for a number of different high street lenders, challenger banks, bridging houses, private individuals in recovering their secured debt against property. And we also deal with more sort of bog standard and complex insolvencies.
That's perfect, and thanks for coming on, Edward. Just for everybody listening, can you give us a kind of a brief description of actually what your key job is as a receiver, what your sort of main business involves you actually doing?
Sure. So in terms of a receiver, it's 1925 Law of Property Act. So I'm appointed by the lender under the terms of their fixed charge, their mortgage, and I'm appointed as an agent of the borrower unless the borrower is subject to some sort of insolvency, whether it be liquidation as a limited company or bankruptcy if it's an individual. And I'm their agent and I have to act in the best interest of the borrower, but I'm instructed by the lender to recover their secured debt.
On a day-to-day basis, can you give me an example of what that sort of involves? Like, what does a normal day for you look like?
I don't really tend to have a normal day. I'm sure you'd say the same for yourself. Every day is different. It could be that I'm discussing a matter which is soon to be appointed over with a lender, talking through the various different options. It could be that I need to speak to tenants to get hold of a tenancy agreement to understand the basis of the occupation of a property. I might have an application to court under a possession hearing, which I need to deal with. I might similarly be injuncted by a borrower who's trying to prohibit us from carrying out the administration of the receivership. I might be writing a report to a lender, setting out what we've done, what the next steps are, what our recommendations are. Discussing position with a borrower. It might be that a building is burnt down and we're having to deal with insurers, or securing a building, having taken possession. You know, every day is different, and in this sort of current climate especially, people are reacting to different announcements and measures taken by the government, and we need to be on board to say, well, this is what's happened and this is how it could potentially impact on you, or revising the strategy that we had agreed on a particular matter. So, yeah, because as I say, at the moment, things are very, very varied on a day-to-day basis.
Now, it sounds as though no 2 days are alike then, basically.
Correct.
In terms of obviously getting into this line of work, how would one, or how would you go about doing it if you were looking to sort of start afresh? Do you need sort of a legal background, or what's the sort of career path for this sort of job?
I think there's very few people that sort of leave school, college, university and decide to be an insolvency practitioner. It's something that you sort of aspire to be. I think that you fall into it through various different means. So my father was actually an insolvency practitioner, so I was aware of the profession. I knew what it involved, and I'd done work experience and sort of worked for him during school holidays from university. So I had a basic understanding. I actually worked for a hedge fund down in London, and I wanted to come back up to Manchester, and this was just a profession that I fell into, really. My partner, Dan, he left school sort of a relatively young age, and he went in as a junior at a national accountancy firm and then ended up in the insolvency department when he then sort of progressed, became a trainee, etc. And now obviously he's an insolvency practitioner, and that's how he fell into it. So you don't need a legal profession. We do have in-house solicitors here that will assist us with sort of day-to-day issues that we may encounter on particular matters. They're not sort of instructed by any third parties directly. They're mainly as a resource for us. So we do have solicitors, but I would say it's more of an accountancy background that's required for be an insolvency practitioner. An understanding of how to sort of digest and take apart a balance sheet really is the principal skill that you would need. The property stuff seems to be a bit more of an add-on that I personally have fallen into.
Yeah, but is there any specific, like, exact qualification that you need in order to do this, or is it just a really broad understanding?
No, to be an insolvency practitioner, you need to have passed what's called your JIEB, which is your Joint Insolvency Examination Board. And that's, I believe it's 3 exams: an exam in personal insolvency, an exam in liquidations, and an exam in administrations. And those exams are sat once a year. The course is sort of for the year building up to it. They are relatively technical. I personally found them more challenging than I did my university degree, but I think everybody's perhaps different in the approach. It's very formulaic. You need to learn the law, you need to know the law, you need to be able to regurgitate the law onto a Word document in order to sort of set out various examples that may or may not happen. Before you do that, some people do what's called a CPI exam, which I think is a certificate in proficiency in insolvency. I'm not sure if it's multiple choice or what it is. I know that some people find that in itself quite difficult, but the JIEB is definitely a step up from that.
But so you don't need a, as you're saying, Dan doesn't have a degree or anything,
No,
so that's not a requirement. You
no,
can literally just
no.
specialize professionally into
Yeah,
into that area.
sure. Some firms would like people to have a degree in order to consider taking them on, but I think, in this day and age, every firm's different. And I personally, if I had my time again, I wouldn't have gone to university and I'd have tried to have done my exams a bit earlier. But, everybody's different. It's easy to say in hindsight, and I suppose university was a good learning block for me in terms of social things, if nothing else.
Yeah, that's generally what it's there for, I think, nowadays.
Yeah,
In
that
terms
and a
of,
bit of debt.
well, yeah, that's where you come in to try and sort it out afterwards.
I
When
don't deal with personal insolvency. I'll make that clear.
No,
I don't do.
okay. It's just the company stuff, and obviously we'll come on to sort of some potential examples a little later of a few things that, if you're willing to share anyway. In terms of the sort of, you were mentioning earlier that you act as an agent for the borrower.
Yeah.
Is that who the sort of that's who you're actually working for? Is so the outcome that you're looking to achieve, is it geared on getting the best outcome for them, or is it the best outcome for the creditors, or is it kind of a
Okay. So
everybody?
I think when I was saying I'm the agent of the borrower, I was referring exclusively to LPA fixed charge receiverships. As an administrator, I would be the agent of the company. I would see a fixed charge receivership and an LPA receivership as a non-formal insolvency matter. And I take instructions from the lender, but I have to act in the borrower's best interests. The Law of Property Act is 1925. In 1925, the law was set by the law lords, and they tend to be the property owners and property lenders. And I still feel that the Law of Property Act is weighted very much in favour of the lender. So the third party that's instructed, i.e. me, I am the borrower's agent, but I act on the instructions of the lender, albeit I need to act in the borrower's best interests.
Yeah, so it's generally, I think that's a very interesting point, and you can see why the rule makers were the landowners sort of previously. So yeah, you can see why that might be sort of slanted that way, and I think that's something definitely I would
It's
like to
just
keep
my
that in.
opinion. It's just my opinion. I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
No, but that would seem historically accurate, I would say. In terms of, so on that, when you're sort of looking to actually, let's say for the work you do for lenders, for example, when you've got a property that the borrower hasn't been able to pay back, who how much autonomy do you have based on that, in terms of, do you have to, if a lender says, oh, we need this amount, can you say, actually, you know, looking at the scenario as a whole, I think this is what you should accept? Or do you have to kind of be a in between and mediate between the parties sort of quite a lot? Is that a lot of your job?
Sorry, so are you saying if a borrower puts forward a full and final settlement offer to a lender, or are you
Yeah,
saying
as
that
in,
in the
if,
market of
yeah,
property?
if you've actually had a look at a case for, say, the last couple of months, and they've
Yeah.
finally sorted something out, or the property's going to sell at a certain amount, and they want to put forward a final settlement offer that you think is a very fair offer, but the lender might kick back on that. How much sway, or what sort of um, authority do you have to actually say, look, you know, you really should accept this?
If a lender's loan is not being redeemed in full, so they're not being repaid in full, then it's up to them as to whether or not they would be willing to accept a lesser amount in order to relinquish their security.
Yeah,
So
so
if a property is worth £100, or there's an offer of £100 and the lender is owed 110, the lender may say, well, you can't sell that for £100 because I'm owed 110. That, you know, realistically, they're never going to get that 110 back unless the market improves. But I can't force a lender to release their security unless I'm appointed as administrator over a company, and I can make an application to court for the court to allow me to sell the property free of the secured lender's charge.
yeah, no, that makes sense, because that's what I was basically getting at, is that how
Yeah.
much actual power over the lenders do you have?
I'd like to think if a lender's instructing us and trusting us to recover their debt, that they will listen to our recommendations. So I'd like to think that if we put formal recommendations to a lender to suggest that they should accept an offer for a property, that given they've had the trust to appoint us in the first place, that they would have the trust to say, well, we accept your recommendations, that you're getting best value. And if my recommendations are flawed, then that's negligence on my part, and I deservedly would be sued.
Okay, yeah, no, that is fair enough. And when it comes to an actual good outcome for your jobs, I know it's probably various sort of examples and all sorts of different deals. What would you say is your, like, a good outcome from something you're instructed on? Let's say just a
The
property.
lender being repaid in full and the borrower emailing me and saying thank you.
Yeah. Does that happen often?
More often than you think, actually. Yeah. Sometimes we try and work with these borrowers. We feel it's very important. We understand that, you know, it's their asset, it's their money, it's their lives. It means a lot more to them than it does to us. For us, we're just doing a job. So we do try and work with them where possible. Obviously, there are examples where people don't want to work with us, don't want to cooperate with us, and want to have a fight with the lender and feel that the world is against them. And they can be more challenging, but we do try and be fair and reasonable with people, and we do find that yeah, we do get more thanks than perhaps one would expect. I wouldn't say that I regularly get sent sort of bottles of spirits from borrowers saying thank you, but you know, it has happened on occasion.
Yeah, and talking of difficult borrowers, is there
Yeah.
any sort of one situation or a couple of situations that you've come across that you'd be able to sort of talk about that have been sort of exceptionally difficult for whatever reason?
I've had a couple that immediately spring to mind. I had a site relatively recently where there was an allegation put forward by the borrower that, and we were involved in court proceedings against him, unfortunately. There was an allegation that the lender's charge had been entered into on an unfair basis. There was unfair prejudice and material irregularity. He said that the interest rate was extortionate. He said that there was a secret commission that had been paid to the broker that had introduced the deal to this particular to this particular financier. So the borrower was trying to set aside the possession order that had been gained. We took possession of the property, and unfortunately, there was 45,000 tons of toxic waste that had been dumped on the property. So the borrower had, in the 2 weeks in the lead up to the repossession, because it was being transferred to the High Court for enforcement, so we had to give 40 days notice of our intention to go in and repossess the property. During that time, he liaised with third-party waste providers. I believe, and I don't want to be quoted 100%, that he'd sort of made out that he had some sort of waste license and dumped all this toxic waste on the site. Now, from my perspective, I then have to ensure that I can sell the site, and I either disclose what's there or I take steps to clean it up. And we were very lucky. We sold the site to an independent third party after a very short period of marketing. We got all the lenders' capital back, a large chunk of their interest, and we then have been successful in pursuing an insurance claim for the cleanup cost of the waste. So all in all, that was a good result. We've had allegations where, when we've repossessed properties, there's been sort of famous artwork, Rembrandt, those different things like that have been in the property, and it's been alleged that even myself or the staff have pilfered those items. That tends to be difficult for us because it's very personal. Clearly, we're not going into properties ourselves, on repossessions, with agents if we're there at all, and certainly not stealing famous artworks. It makes you think why some of these individuals will go and get a bridging loan for 50, 100,000 pounds, but yet would have, say, at the Picasso worth 20 million hanging on the wall of their terraced house. But nonetheless, everybody's different, and it's just not nice when our staff get accused of X, Y, and Z. That bit of the job I don't particularly like. So.
Yeah, I can imagine, from experience, we've seen a lot of borrowers, obviously, and I don't know whether this is common or not, but we find they like to put their head in the sand until it's a little too late,
Yeah.
and then working with them is a lot harder. Whereas we've had borrowers that work with us, and yes, it takes a little bit of time, but everyone comes out with some sort of solution that in the end that they're happy with. And in regards to that toxic waste scenario, and this sort of leads on to another sort of question. If something happens to the site or anything like that that adds additional costs, like cleanup or anything like that, does that typically get added onto the loan, or in that case, obviously insurance covered it, but how do those sort of unforeseen situations sort of
Yeah.
come about, and what happens?
So in a standard legal charge, the lender will be indemnified by the borrower for any costs and expenses in recovering the debt. So all of those costs are added to the debt.
Wow. And that brings me nicely on to, we get a lot of questions about the sort of cost of receivership and how that
Yeah.
works. And if we do appoint an LPA receiver, are you able to give us a sort of brief outline on how those charges are added? Is it sort of per hour, or how does that sort of work?
It depends on the lender and what fee agreement you've got in place with them.
Okay. Is there any sort of industry-wide sort of standard,
The Law
vaguely
of
speaking?
Property Act. The Law of Property Act states you can charge up to 5% of realisations, including sort of all disbursements. So that'd be legal fees, insurance, etc., etc. It's very rare for us that we would actually charge the 5%, but in some instances where the debt may be smaller and it might become protracted and litigious, sometimes, unfortunately, if you're on a time cost basis, then it can be that you do end up charging more than 5% of the debt. So if the debt's 50,000 and you end up having various court matters, then it could be way more than £2,500 that you charge between yourself and all the solicitors, etc. So the 5% is really there as a guide, but I think each case is treated on its merits and is very different.
we get a lot of people saying to us, and obviously we know this isn't true, but or is it? You can you can clear the air on this one. But a lot of receivers seem to, or at least it takes a very long time for that process to go out. And we hear all the time, and not just obviously from our point of view, but when we talk to other brokers, etc., they say other lenders, things take a long time, and the reason for that is purely because the receiver wants to bill more hours.
I
Can you put
I
that to
think
bed?
I think that if that is the case, the lenders should not use that receiver again.
Yeah, whereas I've heard of them taking years to go through, and
I
obviously
think there's
sometimes that's
normally
because the
always a
cost.
reason. I think our average, we did a study on this, we looked at the stats. I think our average life of the receivership is about 3 months.
Oh
So
wow, that's short.
it should not take years.
Yeah, and it's how often do you actually get embroiled in sort of long court cases, or is that a sort of a rarity?
Daily.
Okay. Well, that's at least you get comfortable with that side of things. The
Unfortunately, it's, yeah.
how do you and this is something that I know I struggle with,
Yeah.
is sort of separating um the sort of personal side of things, because I know whenever I've spoken to a borrower, I instantly feel sort of bad, and I try to do what I can, and obviously you're doing this on a daily basis. How do you sort of separate that, and or do you, or does it affect you ever?
It's something I struggle with. I'm not very good at separating it.
Yeah. Is there any sort of tactics that you've built on, or is it just sort of every case might
Nice,
sort of
nice glass of red wine on a Friday night. That's about it.
no, that I think that's a good idea.
Well, I'm not sure if it is or isn't, but sometimes at the time it feels like it is. So
yeah, it's necessary evil. In regards, at the very start of the conversation, you were saying obviously with the way the world is currently, do you see the need for somebody like you increasing over the next sort of 6 to 12 months, or how? What's your sort of prediction in terms of
I
sort of?
I I I don't know. I think it's very difficult to predict the future without making it sound like Cristiano Ronaldo, but you don't know what is going to happen. I would never have predicted the effect of the mini budget having what it had. I think that those, if we're just looking at bridging now, I believe that those bridges that are self-funding or have very stable uh, funding agreements in place may be able to hold assets for longer or resist appointing or resist enforcement if the market does dip, compared to those that are paying a standard premium or a standard rate to their investors on a monthly basis. And I think those that actually have a cost of capital sat there, obviously there's opportunity cost across the board, but the cost of capital, I think those that are finding that that cost is increasing may have to act with a bit more haste, and that could see the market move perhaps a bit quicker than it's destined to do at the moment. I think that a lot of this is will have a multiplier effect and will be down to the banks and how the banks decide to tackle this sort of inevitable recession. In 2007, I was on secondment at a major clearing bank, and their strategy at that time was to put everything into auction. And they did that very quickly. And even if they suffered a loss, they weren't particularly concerned. And I can't see that happening in the next 6 to 12 months. I don't think that people will have the appetite for it. And I think that this potential recession could be over relatively quickly if consumer confidence returns, as long as external factors don't influence things too heavily in terms of foreign investment, etc.
Yeah, let's hope so. And have you seen any sort of correlation with your business that in terms of interest rates, or is there anything that typically you see out there that is an indication that actually
Well, I think
you might get busier?
last week we had maybe 10 to 15 completions due on the, I think it was towards the start of the week. It was like the Monday, Tuesday. And a number of people couldn't, when they hadn't exchanged, they actually couldn't complete because the mortgage offers were pulled or terms changed. I do think that's settled down a little bit since then, since the height of that. But I don't. The honest answer is it going to impact on my business? I don't know. I can't say one way or another. I think there's too many things up in the air. I think a lot of people are struggling, but does that mean that banks are going to start enforcing more at this stage? Personally, I don't think they will. Whether or not they will be at the start of the first quarter of 2023, maybe. But I think a lot depends on how hot it is over the next 3 to 4 months and what happens with inflation and other things such like that.
For your business, obviously, that occasionally, as things get worse, it can get better for you, or potentially might get busier for you. Without sounding sort of really mercenary, is that something you occasionally not hope for, but a sort of not exactly, it's not as bad for you when things turn bad, or does it impact you as well?
I think it impacts everybody. I think there's a general mood, there's a general sort of feeling. Look, I don't know how you found it, but I think over the last couple of months, the last few weeks especially, people have been very frustrated, just in a day-to-day life. People you're dealing with have got less patience, and I think attitudes are shifting a little bit. People are more uneasy with the current climate, uncertainty in the future as to what's going to happen. And I just think people are looking at things in a slightly different way, and I do think that very much impacts on me. Yeah, even this week, I've had calls. I need to see you tomorrow at 8 o'clock in my office in London. I've got to go through this with you. It's critical. So I think that life is a lot more difficult for everybody in a recession, and people's expectations have changed somewhat in terms of what can be delivered in what space of time, and that makes it harder for us as well.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And then I think that we'll call it a day for now,
Cheers,
if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Is there any, for everyone listening, if you want to sort of plug anything, or if let people know where they can find you, or is that not something you really need to worry about? It's up to you. If you do, fire away.
I think that obviously we're always open to help people if we can. The only thing that I would say is that anybody's listening to this and they've got a receiver appointed is to try and sort of work with that individual, bearing in mind the cost position. And if they can't work with them, then find the appropriate solicitors that will try and engage and try and bring everything to a satisfactory conclusion for all parties. And I would also make sure that throughout the process, if a receiver is appointed over asset you own, you document what you're doing and how you're doing it very well so that you can share that with third parties. And when you look back on things, you can see what was done and why it was done. And if there is any potential issues that you could then pursue, then you're open to doing that yourself.
No, I appreciate that. That's some good advice, I think, for everyone. And yeah, on that note, we'll call it a day. So thanks so much for your time, Edward. Really appreciate it.
Cheers,
And then we'll speak soon. All right.
All the very best. Cheers. Thanks,
Cheers.
mate. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.